Your chapter meetings and your engagement with NAV Canada is quite important to engage our general managers and area control center, tower managers, etc. across the country. That's important on a local level, and some of the stuff we're doing on a national level I think is also important. We had a really good session organized by Leo and the folks in Montreal at that chapter a while ago to talk a bit about engaging a discussion on space-based ADSB and what that does to airspace in certain parts of Canada. So safety and the quality of this product is going to remain at the forefront of our strategy as we go forward. The current trends that we're seeing as an overall corporation is traffic's going really, really well. June we were 6% higher than the prior year. It's a bit of a surprise. Our safety continues, as I just mentioned, to be positive. The service charges and the reduction, we've announced some changes that I'll come to in a slide here. Pretty positive reception, not a lot of discussion when you're not increasing the rates and maybe decreasing the rates or rebating or issuing credits, usually pretty easy to talk about. And we're real close to finalizing that with our board here later this month. From the traffic point of view, it's important to see what's going on here. This is 2017 forecast, which we've only got one month left for our fiscal year at NAV Canada. Ends the end of August. And we see a 5.4%. We've seen a significant growth in these revenues of weighted charging units, and it was unexpected. It's well above what we forecasted. Historically, the trend of air traffic growth at NAV Canada as it was tracked really was consistent with GDP. But starting in April 2016, we've seen some unprecedented growth. And I guess that's in your business, business aviation, long haul and short haul, domestic and transborder, all. So this has resulted in a rate reduction that was implemented back in September of 2016 of, I think it was 3.9% across the board at NAV Canada overall as far as weighted charging units, then broken out into whether it was terminal or en route or daily, etc. And then a 3.7 temporary for that year that was intended. So air traffic growth, worldwide, it's been going, I think, like this for all of our colleagues around the world. Whether it's fuel prices or whether it's the desire to travel, I'm not sure, but it's good. But it's also something that keeps us on our toes to be challenged to make sure we're aligned with, and not just from what the rate's going to be, but the infrastructure, the resources, the people, etc. So the rate curve as far as performance looks like this. As I mentioned, within a few weeks here, we're gonna know if the temporary rate reduction that was put into place last year is going to go away, and it's highly likely it will. And we've got a situation where we've got too much of your money, and we need to refund or rebate some of that back. All in all, about $60 million will be rebated over the next 3 to 6 months to the operators that contributed to that increase in our rate stabilization fund. We've also set ourselves up to do some, I'll call it temporary increase in capital investment in facilities, in systems, and we've got a fairly active effort underway as it pertains to resources with staffing. So the stakeholder relations part of that is, I would say NAV Canada is going through a change. A real change to, and I think this is consistent with many companies, 20 years old. We did a lot of great things coming in the transition from government, and we think we can do a lot more great things. And one of the areas, and a big area, is to really recognize who the key stakeholders are. Our employees, our customers, and our other stakeholders such as airports and other community interests. So we're going to put a huge amount of effort, I say a huge amount of effort, not necessarily in the sense of resources, but in the sense of time and attention to the relationship with airports in Canada, and looking out 3 to 5 years at what we can do together, whether it's our technicians working on RILS, being able to help them in a more cost-affordable way, because some of these airports are not very well funded. So we think we can work wiser and have a real net positive impact to all operators, whether that's members of COPA, CBAA, or ATAC. At the end of the day, we're well placed to facilitate a lot of collaboration to do some good things to improve safety and reduce the overall cost impact. I could look at the Toronto construction in the spring as a good example. There's not a lot of time required for the debrief. It was poor planning on a lot of people's part. So as we go forward, Rudy mentioned earlier the relationship we have with GTAA. We have a pretty strong commitment from Howard Ng, the CEO of the GTA, and our CEO to really approach things much differently in a collaborative sense, to look at these type of things 3 to 5 years out. So when a runway has to be closed for any length of time, we really need to be on the ball and making sure all of our stakeholders, whether it be through our NAV Canada forums or through these type of forums, are aware of what's going on, and you as operators don't get surprised. Public awareness, that's another thing that was probably, I don't want to say neglected, but we didn't put as much effort into it in the past with respect to airspace changes and things of intended of good nature for efficiency, whether it's RNPs or other changes. And consequently, if you read the papers, you read about the concerns from the public as it pertains to their views of noise. So going forward, we've had to amend our way of doing business to make sure we allow to compensate for fair listening, otherwise known as collaboration, and looking at sometimes increased track miles as a trade-off to get other things in place that benefit us all. So that's the second main area of stakeholder relations that is probably a new effort NAV Canada Service Delivery Group, our group, is looking at. And then the third is staffing. We've held different staffing strategies over the years, and during tough economic times we were quite successful at controlling costs. But as traffic growth comes the way it comes now, we find ourselves in a short staffing situation in a few places in the country. There's probably 6 locations that are what we call seriously at risk of service disruption. But nationally, we have a plan in place to get ourselves, and it's a fairly it's an important plan. The executive and management are directly tied, their performance to it. And that's to get us to 100% of our requirement by 2021, which still allows us to use a certain amount of overtime to compensate for absences and other things. And that's built into our financial plan, which is built into our rate forecast and how things look going forward. But it's a fairly, it's an important focus. And I just want to assure you that whether we're talking about restrictions out of Vancouver Terminal, or short staff in Calgary Terminal, or Winnipeg Tower, there's a huge amount of emphasis going on within our teams to deliver. So that's it's no problem. We can handle that. Right now in the system of training air traffic management personnel, we have close to 250 students off the industry, not current existing controllers, in the training system, and our success rates have improved, and we anticipate continuous improvement because of some of the changes we've made to various things with the technology, etc. But that's about 3 times what we would have had in the training system 2 years ago. It'll probably stay full like that for 5 to 10 years, because we're going to get better at looking forward to those staff requirements beyond 1 and 2 years focus that we've traditionally looked at. So we have room to improve, and that's what we're working on there. So now I want to turn the attention over to space-based ADS-B, surveillance from low Earth orbiting satellites. The company Arion, NAV Canada is a 51% shareholder. Our other partners are the Irish Aviation Authority, ENAV of Italy, Naviair of Denmark, and Iridium, because Iridium owns the prime satellite that's hosting our payload. We had our first launch on a SpaceX Falcon 9 on January 14th. We had successfully deployed all 10 satellites into orbit, and those 10, or 8 of those 10 stayed on one plane, so within 2 to 3 weeks of launch we had pretty accurate data of ADS-B aircraft transponders around the world. That I will share some of that with you. So I think it's if it's not known to you why we got on board and why we would invest $150 million in a company, I want to share that. It simply was an opportunity of probably of a generation. When we look at it, or maybe even a century, the Iridium had went out and built a plan of $3 billion to relaunch the Iridium Next satellite constellation, 72 satellites for primarily communication purposes. And, you know, they've got a wide customer base. And the idea of putting an ADS-B receiver box, 50 kilos, on the belly of that satellite is how I refer to it, on the lower part of that payload looking down, came about. And we had to move fast. We saw the global transition that was already in place with ADS-B mandate requirements in Australia, United States, and in Europe. We didn't have a mandate in Canada at that time. We still don't. And we really felt this is going to be the largest disruption in air traffic management probably since radar. And I'll share with why we still feel that way. In fact, we feel more confident in those earlier analysis than we did at the time, how we do today. So what we got here is, I think I went by one slide here, but I wanted to mention what that picture right there is just for the people that like airplanes and rockets, that's what the Falcon 9 capsule looks like with 10 satellites. You've got 2 rows of 5 satellites there. When that gets to orbit and the fairing is long gone, the most important part for us of that mission is releasing those 10 satellites. Well, maybe the most important is their communication back to Washington, that they're working well. But as everybody gets excited when they see the SpaceX Stage 1 land on that barge, although that's really nice, what's really important for that launch cost is that those 10 things get off and released in the right place into orbit. And that's going, so far it goes well, but every one of them, I'd be lying if I told you there wasn't a little bit of stress when you watch a launch and you've got an investment on that launch. Even though it's insured and we have spares, it's still important and it's working so far well. This picture is a snapshot of 62 hours because we only had 8 satellites working, but we used this to really drive home the global impact. And since various other air navigation service providers, some of them are state-owned, have started to see this, it really resonates that the world is that close to having 1-second updates of every airplane that's Mode S in the world, regardless of where it is, depending on who has that access to that global data or to their flight information regional data. So people that are interested in flow management in Asia, in the Middle East, in London, tie that together with the ATM technology we're working on now with time-based separation to sequencing a few hundred miles out down to the 30-second interval. It gets quite efficient and quite realistic that the advanced planning of what is going to go on becomes that much better. And that's an industry thing. That's important to be aligned with the avionics, the OEMs, everyone, the operators. But this picture really drove home that this was real. The performance that we're seeing out of this is, so when we made the investment, we based on design goals of update intervals of from 600 kilometers away that we'd get a signal every 8 seconds. As you can see, our test data says we are getting it every 6.21 seconds update rate. That's comparable or better to some radar. The latency, which was intended to be sort of 2 a second at 400 milliseconds, is actually better at 321 milliseconds. The Squitter is putting that out. And really what surprised the heck out of us was the slant range coverage of the Earth was designed that each receiver would pick up a 2,250 kilometer path. It's actually coming in at the 3,800. And we don't have time in this session for me to run some animation. We have to see those airplanes globally, but if you're ever in our area, we'd be happy to share some of that with you. The real push that was required by NAV Canada and by Aerion and its shareholders was to really understand the value of surveillance. So we did that by looking at the North Atlantic, at trying to understand the value of surveillance. And early on, we pushed a lot on the economic benefits, which I've got one slide that I'll go quickly over, but the value is really safety, particularly if we look at unsurveilled airspace such as the North Atlantic. And the thing that sort of surprised us ATM-type folks was we didn't really realize that the selected flight level in the flight management computer, when it changes, sends something through that Mode S transmission into our ATM system that we've built to identify a discrepancy in the flight plan in our ATM system and what's selected. So the reality is, as soon as you are flying ADS-B equipped and you're being received into an ATM system ADS-B equipped, and you select a flight level change, our controller should be aware. We had a scenario going off the coast of Newfoundland with a large carrier about 3 months ago where we actually saw this happen. It was under ground-based surveillance of ADS-B at the time, not space-based, where the selected flight level went from a flying altitude of, I think, 29 down to 27. The controller queried the airplane, "What are you doing?" And they decided to move for turbulence, and they were re-cleared to 37. Well, from 2.5 hours in the North Atlantic, we wouldn't have known that in the past. So the value of surveillance we tried to look at from a collision risk modeling. And we were able to look at last year's incidents. And last year's incidents on the North Atlantic brought in the target level is 10 to the minus 9s, 5 fatal accidents per 1 billion flight hours. We're not at target level. Last year it was closer to like 15 with the incidents. But what the team of international mathematicians that worked together did was they looked at all those incidents and they said, if we had surveillance in Prestwick or Gander, and the controller being notified would the incident have happened. So when they discounted all the incidents that wouldn't have happened, that went down to 3.7, I believe, or just around 4, well under the target level of safety. So when we think about the North Atlantic now, we can't think about it the way we thought about it in 1975. It is getting much closer to domestic airspace. And the traffic volume that's happening there is also driving at a rapid rate between now and 2032 forecast at an average of about 4% a year. That corridor is getting busier. So in a lot of cases, for many of you, you're going above it. But guess what? Those new generation airplanes that we see called Dreamliners and others are also going up there. So we need to be ahead of that, and we think we are ahead of it. The economic side is, it is important because people are going to have to pay us for it, but it's almost a no-brainer. It's a net investment here, or a net cost over 15 years of $1.1 billion for a conservative estimated benefit, primarily here to the commercial traffic of 6.6 billion in savings for a net of about 5.5. So the money really works in an unsurveilled airspace on the North Atlantic. But what's interesting is, let's look at Canada. And why this is interesting for us because we operate here. It's also interesting to get on this and provide this information around the world because people keep investing in ground-based equipment. That's a picture of our current ground-based infrastructure of radars and ADS-B. We've got 40 radars, give or take, a couple, I think it's 42. And some of those are primary and secondary, and they're primarily along the border where we've got terminal airspace. We've got a lot of northern radars, and we have a capital program right now to invest in 10 new radars at about $10 to $12 million per radar. That's some serious capital that we've got allocated. But we don't have a program to replace all 40 with ground-based radars. What we think we will be doing is 3 applications of space-based ADS-B domestically in Canada, because the performance is that good that we're not worried about the interference and the noise. We're going to overlay what I'll call the prime dense airspace in southern Canada, so that if we lose a secondary radar in Montreal or Hamilton, we've got immediate coverage, and the controller shouldn't see the change in where the surveillance source is coming from. We're using a new technology called Fusion for that purpose. Other ANSPs are using it also. The second area of implementation of this technology is in northern Canada. We feel pretty confident that if we are successful with the ADSB mandate, that I'm going to come to in a minute, which really affects equipage in Canada, that we should be able to decommission probably 21 of those radars and all of our ground-based ADSB and the maintenance costs that go with it. So there's an estimated net benefit of about $150 million over the 15-year life cycle to the costs within Canada of the ANS as far as ground-based equipment. And the third area is the current unsurveilled area of the polar sector, Edmonton's Arctic high specialty. That traffic on the polar activities is also growing. I think in the last 2 years it went up something like 19 to 20% of long haul. So that value is primarily safety. There's not an efficiency sort of value there. That's a safety thing and a consistent thing for teaching and training air traffic controllers. Because every air traffic controller in this country has surveillance capabilities, their ability to train consistently the same and bring a more consistent system from Moncton's FIR to Edmonton's FIR will be evident to you in the airplane in the long run. It'll also be very cost effective to us at cross-training and bringing on new people. So now the key point here is the aeronautical study process that we need to go through to change the mandated airspace and transponder requirements in Canada. So I saved this to last because I know my good friend Denis Guédon is after me, and he's with Transport Canada. But I'm happy to say we've had an outstanding relationship with Transport on how to approach this. This is just the process on how the aeronautical study works. But I'll skip that and say we've got to do fair consultation, and we've got to be able to do this in a real constructive way that is done well the first time so we don't have to go back and do it. So the terms of reference, or the terms of reference for what should be mandated or how we should go about looking at the mandate in Canada, we're hopefully going to be complete by the end of this month. We're working collaboratively with Transport Canada on that, so we're taking on board their input because that has a direct effect on how they would look at it instead of the Transport Canada having to go out to do the same thing after NAV Canada. So I look at it that we're doing it together to do it well the first time and the only time. After that terms of reference, we then intend to take publish the TOR and then consult between sort of October across the country to CBAA chapter types, COPA chapter types, and the commercial carrier groups, as well as the NAV Canada forums, on what we think is the right type of airspace to have mandated. And the desire is to have an implementation date after that, and it is not anticipated that would mean everything at once. This is the sort of scope of the terms of reference. It's going to encompass all classes of airspace. I mean, we really want to get Class A and B implemented relatively quickly. That's how I'll say it. I mean, my goal would probably be more aggressive than the team that's actually doing it. That's just because of my patience. But we want to do that because the equipage is up over 90% right now. And this, so whatever the question will be is what's the flight level? And then what's not equipped under that flight level. But then we get to Class C, and fortunately there's a mandate south of the border for 2020 to 10,000 feet, ADSB equipped. And, then we get into our Canadian airspace structure that has a lot of Class E and a lot of Class D. Some of that airspace would probably be really wise to have mandatory ADSB to the ground, because we're going to see the targets. That data that I shared on slides earlier that we were picking up signals. We're picking up 18-watt signals off vehicles in Dublin from space. So if we're able to pick, and I'm not saying we're going to pick up vehicles everywhere in the world to that extent, but I know that if we put a ground-based ADS-B receiver in one airport and tie that to the space base, we'll probably have quite the technology for vehicle monitoring and aircraft monitoring, not to mention the type of surveillance that's required around the oil sands, where there's 5 aerodromes all aligned, and today we've got a defined area of mode C and a mandatory transponder. But, you know, as we transition, there's a lot more places in the country that this mode S will allow for quite a significant impact to safety and efficiency, whether it's holding for IFR clearances or other. So the key now is not whether the satellites will work, not whether this is a good thing. It's how quickly we can get the benefits from a safety perspective or an economic perspective into this country and around the world. Because as a 51% owner of that company and as a non-for-profit company, what we're able to do here, and I'd say we're going to do our best to lead a lot of it here in Canada, is demonstrate a significant global change in air traffic management and how we have better tools to operate the trajectory of these airplanes around the world much more efficiently. So I'll leave it at that. If there's, I'm happy to talk about any of this or anything I may have not covered, or answer any questions, subject to Merlin allowing me to, because I'm not sure if I've abused my time here or not. So that's my short, maybe not that short, presentation. We've got a lot on the go, and it's pretty exciting. And I'm really happy that it's aligning with a lot on the go in your business, because that's pretty exciting to us too. So thank you.